We good? Okay. So good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Wright, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in hardware. And I'm going to talk to you about a process that I'm working on with a friend of mine called the HRES, the Hardware Reverse Engineering Standard. This process is based on the PTES. Anybody here who does pen testing in the house? Pen testers, raise your hand. Slick. Okay, got a couple. So the PTES is the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, and this process is based on that. So we can have a defined way to do hardware reverse engineering. So we're talking to you about that today, and talk about what we need to do, the steps for doing a good security assessment of an embedded device, whatever that device may be. And if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll walk through this. So a little bit about me. My name is Tim Wright. Currently, I'm the team lead for the Red Team in American Electric Power in Columbus. Great company to work for, and I do a lot of this for my company on everything from tablets to SCADA devices, right? Something we might plug into our infrastructure. 19 years of IT background, and you can hit me on the Twitters at redteam_hacker. And my buddy Stephen Hollis, his slide's on here. He's not here today. But he is a security researcher in Dayton at a company called Pre-Talon. And Gino Nullfree is him on the Twitters. Okay. So a little background. So is embedded device security a new problem? No, not at all. This has been out there for a long time, but it's getting a lot more attention now just because we're seeing a lot more people going after these embedded devices. There's been some attacks on embedded systems on different infrastructures. We're seeing malware being embedded into firmware. And so this is not new. It's been there for years. We're also seeing more and more powerful microcontrollers being developed. Things like Raspberry Pi 3 that's out now with built-in wireless on the board. So we're seeing more powerful devices in a smaller footprint. And so one, that's got people looking, whether it's just the casual hacker, and I say hacker in a good sense, right? Because we're pulling apart these devices and understanding what they do and seeing if we can do other stuff with them. Then we also have the malicious attackers who are looking at these devices and trying to find ways to compromise them. Shadow IT, or bring your own devices. We have a lot of IT groups out there now are dealing with how are they going to manage people bringing their own devices into an infrastructure, whether it's their cell phone, tablet, they're letting people bring in their own laptops, computing devices. And when I say shadow IT, I know everyone here has we don't see this ever, but when the users decide they want to set up their own wireless, their own cellular bridge, deploy it on our network, and then use that so they can do whatever they need to do on the network, that's the shadow IT that's getting dropped into our networks, right? So everything now is hitting the internet for content. We're downloading updates from the internet. We're pushing, updates to our Facebook, to Twitter, to whatever social media choice we're using out there. We're sending data out into the cloud for our cloud provider to manage for us. So everything now is hitting the web for content, which means all of that is opening up our internal infrastructures for more attack. So the problem here, though, is that we're doing all this security testing on these embedded devices, but we haven't really defined a standard on how we need to do this. So a lot of companies now are offering this as a service, but it's their own secret sauce. They're doing it their own way. They're not really telling us what they're doing for an assessment. And so you see these reports come in saying, yeah, I looked at your device and it looks fine to me. And maybe all they're doing is just a NESA scan. Or they're just doing some basic port scans of the device and trying to do a basic scan of a web interface, and that's all you get. And I think we need more than that, right? Again, we're not following a defined standard, and it's becoming really difficult to have a repeatable process defined to do this work over and over again. So that we know we're getting in, we're actually analyzing the devices, finding the vulnerabilities that can impact our infrastructures. So in this image, what I wanted to show was the difference between a network pen test and a hardware security assessment. So on the right, we see a design of a network, right? So our pen testers in the house know when we go in and we're doing a pen test, we see multiple networks, multiple domains, servers, Ethernet devices, wireless, whatever. That's all going to be in scope for us to do a pen test, right? We're going to own those devices. We're going to do post-exploitation. We're going to get domain creds, run Mimikatz in the Windows boxes, and then everything's going to be awesome. We're going to have shells galore. But on the right, this is a hardware security assessment. It's going to be a workbench. We have a multimeter, an oscilloscope, a couple of USB devices like a HRES. We're going to pull that device apart. We're going to do some soldering on the board, and we're going to analyze the signals. We're going to analyze what's going on in the bus. So it's a much different type of security assessment, and that's really the scope that we need to understand. But with this, you can absolutely do that. We could pivot from this and get into that infrastructure, depending on how this device is, what it's running, what kind of OS, what kind of level of credentials, etc. we could get off this box. So just kind of give an understanding for people who have not done this type of work before. So I'm not the first, and Steven's not the first to talk about this work. There's a lot of people out there doing research on this and talking about embedded. Daryl has done a lot of presentations, Matthew as well, on different type of embedded attack vectors from SNMP, printers, and Preda, Daryl's tool and Preda. It's really cool. It's in my toolkit. I still run it all the time, and it's still viable. All these years, he's been talking about it, and I still see machines, printers on the network that are vulnerable to this stuff. Relic, Dave Kennedy, has a lot of talks on embedded. His home automation talk from DEF CON 19, outstanding stuff. Joe Grand, Travis Goodspeed, Kevin Finisterre, Steve Riley, all these guys are doing research on embedded, right? Because we've been saying it for years, there's these hidden vulnerabilities there, and it's a lot easier when you think about it because we don't have to deal with AV. A lot of these boxes are just, once you get a shell, you're good. No one's ever going to see you. So what are some of the risks to organizations? So we look at these embedded devices, things like data exfiltration, losing that intellectual property via an embedded device, access to our network. So again, I talked a little bit about this, using the embedded device as a pivot into your infrastructure. Physical damage. So when we get into, especially power grid SCADA type systems, they're very delicate. Doesn't take much to take one of these offline. So we could actually see some of these devices, bless you, some of these devices damaged for some of these attacks. Modification, where the firmware is modified and the attacker can maintain persistence, or we have data that's being modified, where if you have an example, back in the day when you had the old satellite TV systems, and you could clone the satellite card and steal service, and you get free cable, right? Well, some of us would be like, yeah, who cares? But if you're a company and you're trying to stay in business, that's loss of revenue, right? And then, I'm sorry, that's theft of service. I got ahead of myself there. But data tampering for the modification. So if we're actually doing billing or something like that, that would be data tampering. So some of the common embedded vulnerabilities that I've been seeing, and this is not an exhaustive list, I just wanted to put some of the things that I've seen. Stack overflows, code execution, and denial of service vulnerabilities. Again, if we're fuzzing some of the applications out there and we're seeing some problems in this, this is the common type software vulnerabilities that we would see in some of this C and C++ code that's out there. Undocumented backdoors, and I see this a lot, where somebody will put a undocumented operating system user ID and password on the box and not disable it. It'll get rolled out into your operating system, or onto your network, and then as you're reversing, you'll see this account sitting on the box, and you can actually SSH or telnet into the box and have a root login. Physical compromise via the console or debugs. This is your JTAG, your I2C, your UART connectivity on the board. Wireless protocol compromise, and that's everything from 802.11 to 800 megahertz wireless, Zigbee, stuff like that, Bluetooth. Weak cryptography, so any type of crypto management system that might be on the box, if it's not deployed properly, that could be compromised. If they're using the same key on every device they've ever put on the internet, and you buy one and reverse it and you now have the keys for everything, we've never seen that happen. Weak firmware management processes, so if there's a this web management interface that's pulling down a firmware image, and you can manipulate the URL and say, go get this firmware. Then you can, modify the firmware and upload your backdoor that way. And then finally, web interface attacks, which is our standard OWASP attacks on web interfaces. So I want to walk through some of these risk examples that I've outlined. So Seagate NAS had a hard-coded root password. This was just a network-attached storage device. Had wireless capabilities, and the researcher who found this was able to compromise the box with the root account, and then once they were on the box, they were able to use it as a pivot into the infrastructure. Also, they could gain access to the data that was stored on the device. There's a CVE out on this as well. But this is very common stuff. It's more common than you actually think, having these hard-coded credentials. The Moonworm, this was a Linksys vulnerability, targeted port 80 and 8080, that when it first started, it was just knocking down your Linksys device. So it's like a denial of service vulnerability, but then it got tooled up where you could actually get remote code execution on the box and gain remote access into the device. This is really cool. This is the smart toilet. This is what everybody needs. And if you know me, you'll know why this is in the slide. Sorry. So this is the smart toilet. It's a Bluetooth controlled toilet, so you can use your smartphone with it, play music while you're in the loo. It has a deodorizer feature so that if, the wife decides that you didn't courtesy enough, she could actually hit the deodorizer function with her phone. So Bluetooth is really a short-range protocol. We don't have to worry about an attacker possibly compromising it. And so it was okay that the manufacturer hard-coded a pin of 0000 into the toilet so that you could just peer with this thing. But again, no worries. Bluetooth is a short-range protocol. Unless you hook up a sniper rifle to a Bluetooth adapter, and then you can reach out quite a ways and affect someone's toilet. Okay, so Black Energy, this was interesting. This is the malware that put 225,000 people in the dark in the Ukraine. So this started off as a phishing attack, but it allowed the attacker to gain a foothold in the infrastructure and then spend time poking around and looking at the infrastructure and how it worked, which ultimately they figured out that the substation had remote connectivity they were able to get out and turn on and turn off the power and manage the power on this infrastructure. And so what happened was they utilized a kill disk component. And it was two things they did. First, they turned off the power at the remote substations, and then they used the kill disk to wipe the disks of all of the machines that were managing those substations, and they rebooted them. So when those machines went down and came back up, no disk operating system, and so the power was off. And so they had to physically go out. This is where the manual process kicked in, but it took time. They had to go out to each one of these places, turn on the power, and that took about 8 or 10 hours to get the power back on, and ultimately affected 225,000 people. And I thought Mike Tyson's Black Energy drink was really cool. And it's kind of cool here because you really don't want to mess with the power, man, because you can get knocked out. I thought that was kind of cool. So ultimately, I think the risk justifies the work, right? I think that what we're telling our organizations is we just don't want to buy a device and plug it in our infrastructure because we don't know what we're opening our infrastructures to. We should have some time. We should have a process to review what these devices are, right? I see a lot of times my company is buying boxes and we're taking a look at those, but then there's a lot of other companies that's just like, oh, it's just an embedded device. Who cares? Well, we all should, right? Because ultimately there's an operating system underneath that hood. So we as the security community need to come together and define a process on how to test this stuff. The bad guys, the threat actors, are doing this work. They're already looking into this stuff. They're trying to figure out how to break these devices more and more. And so we need more than just a risk assessment here. We need to be doing the actual testing of these boxes. And so what we're recommending is how do we do the testing? We're talking about the HRES, which is the hardware reverse engineering standard. This is going to be an open source, publicly available framework for doing testing. It's licensed under the GFDL 1.2, just like the PTES. And we're going to kind of talk through the process. And I have a mind map that I'll bring up here in a second. I've been doing some more work on this and we can talk about it. But in essence, when I was talking to Dave Kennedy and some other folks who were really key players in developing the PTES. And I feel like this is a standalone process because it's a little bit different, as we saw. This is a workbench device. We're ripping it apart versus doing a network pen test. So when we look at the PTES process on the left, there's 7 steps: pre-engagement interactions, intelligence gathering, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, exploitation, post-exploitation, and reporting. Okay? So what we're recommending is the same high-level bucket process, but then going into more detail in some of these sections where we're actually going to be breaking the hardware apart. So that gives us a standard framework for doing this work. And so this is my really generic mind map, and I have a better one that I'll pull up in a second. But can you guys see that okay, or is that really horrible? Okay, let me pull up my... Is that a little bit better? Can you guys see a little bit cleaner? Okay, cool. So when we start talking about the HRES process and looking at the pre-engagement interactions, right? So we're developing our ROE, meeting with the customer, those things that we would normally do if we're doing consulting work or doing pen testing, right? Where we're going to outline how we're going to do our assessment. But then as we start moving through the bigger process buckets and we're looking at like intelligence gathering and target identification, this is where we're going to start looking at like what firmware version are we running on the box. We're going to download the chip documentation from the webs so we can know exactly what type of chips are on the board. Identify the wireless that's emanating from the device. Identify data moving on the bus during boot up with a multimeter, things like that. Going all the way through creating a design or taking a picture of our board, identifying our data pins, doing our threat models, and then actually getting into the vulnerability assessment phase where we're doing active and passive testing. We're doing validation of some of our findings. And then we're doing research, right? So we're using things like the HRES to get the management interfaces on the board. We're using Benwalk to extract the firmware of the device so we can actually see the file system. Exploitation, right? We're actually getting into, if we need to write some code, if we're fuzzing, we find a vulnerability and it's a SEH overflow and we need to write that code. That's where we're going to do that in that phase. Then we got our post-exploitation where we're going to pillage. So if we find those default SSH keys sitting on the box, we'll pull those off so we can get into multiple of our boxes and demonstrate risk. And then reporting phase, and we all love to write reports. I hate writing reports. But this is where we're going to do it. And so some of these are one-to-one mappings, right? Some of the things I'm talking about here are not unique to the HRES. We're borrowing from the PTES because it's such an established and defined process. We're just changing what we need for the hardware reverse engineering. Okay? So I'm going to kind of walk through some of these processes again real quick at a higher level. But when you start doing this stuff, and AEP is a very big safety culture for a power company. We want to make sure everybody goes home at the end of the night. And so I'm asking everyone here, as you start doing some of this research, if you decide to, please safety first. If you're using and playing with power, you're putting your hands into a device, make sure it's properly grounded. Make sure you're not touching something that's live because you can get hurt, you can get killed. And I don't want anybody here to get hurt or killed because we all are researchers and I want to make sure we continue doing what we're doing. So again, our pre-engagement interactions, this is where we're going to talk to our customer or whoever it might be. I generally ask for 2 devices when I do this testing. I have one for non-destructive testing where I have it sitting on the bench. I can do port scans. I can test my proof of concept code against it. And I have one for destructive testing. I'm going to take the case apart. I'm going to solder onto the board. I may pull the chip off. That box may not run when I'm done, right? So that's why you want 2 boxes so you can actually pull the thing apart and do what we need to do. We're going to define our testing goals. What are we trying to achieve with this test? I like to wrap goals around. Are we looking at insider threat? Is this thing sitting on the internet with some kind of cellular gateway and we want to try to compromise that remotely? What's the goals of the assessment? Right? And then if there's any special programming or debugging cables, You're going to have to request those too from the vendor. I've had a lot of the devices that I test where there might be a special coupler that goes on the device. And so I have to request that from whoever has given us the hardware so I can make sure I can interface properly. Or try to build one, and that's kind of a pain. So I put this in. This is copyright law. United States Code Title 17, Section 906. I am not a lawyer, but I put this in just so you know it was there. In essence, it says, as security researchers, we are allowed to reverse engineer a device for the purposes of identifying security threats, security risks. Please have your lawyers within your organization review this and make sure that this is cool. But I've seen a lot of education, a lot of colleges pointing at this, saying this is why we can reverse engineer. And so I put this in my slides. Yes, sir. I don't have the answer to that. The thing that I was reading online about this, and when I gave this talk the last time, and Daryl and I were talking, I did some research. It seems that if you're just looking at something from a security, understanding how it works, or if there's vulnerabilities from a security perspective, you're okay. If you're trying to steal the intellectual property and make your own device and somehow profit from that, you're not okay. So there's a line there. As long as you're doing research on it, it seems like you're okay. But again, I would say if you're doing this for your organization, talk to your organization's the lawyers, and make sure that you're good. Okay. So again, intelligence gathering. So this is everything from looking at the chips. And so if you look at a chip, and I'll show you guys here on the walkthrough in a second, each chip is stamped with its own unique identifier. You can Google those identifiers and actually pull down the spec sheet of each chip that's on the board and understand exactly what the chip is and the pin out, find out which pin is your power pin, etc. So you can download all of that, photograph the device before you disassemble or as you're taking it apart because photos help put it back together. I don't know how many dads we have in the room, but when I build something for my daughter when she was much younger, you'd always have that 3 or 4 extra bolts that'd be laying around. Well, when you have an electronic device and you have a couple extra parts, that's probably not a good thing. So it's all supposed to go back into the box. We just have to make sure we get it back in, and photos can help. Plus, for the reporting phase, that'll help show what you were doing. Identify the chips using our multimeter to identify our pins. Exploiting I2C, UART, JTAG, things like that. And then finally, there could be some anti-tamper mechanisms on these devices. I'm seeing more and more of these devices now that have buzzers, alarms, lock bits, glitch detection built into these devices. So if somebody takes the cover off, things happen. It doesn't work. Or if you're trying to connect into the onboard debug cable or adapter and you don't have a specific type of cable, it may not actually give you the interface properly. So these are things you may have to try to identify as you're doing your reversing. So threat modeling, get into the threat modeling process. I can use threat models for a lot of different ways, and I talk about one here where we actually, if you have multiple devices you have to test, a threat model can actually help you prioritize what work you need to do first. So and depending on your business, you could have a gas meter with a custom RF interface that's sending like customer data back to your infrastructure. You could have remote access support into the device via some type of wireless AP, or you could have customer billing data being sent unencrypted over mesh infrastructure. And you have all these different devices doing this, and you have to prioritize what your work is. Well, you can use a carver to help you prioritize that work. And you could also use the carver just to help understand what the threat is, right? So carver is criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability, right? And you can risk rank those from a score of 1 to 10, and then based on your risk score, you can actually show mathematically what you think the risk is to your organization based on your carver. And I thought I had an image of my carver, and it might be in my report section. But this is really kind of a quick and dirty way you can put it into an Excel spreadsheet and, mature your tool over time to give you the risk score you need to show something that you think is fairly accurate. Vulnerability assessment, I'm going to spend a lot of time here, but this is everything from soldering jumpers on the board extracting data from our flash chips, stuffing data on the bus with logic analyzer, and then actually reverse engineering any type of client software. Sometimes you get a Java client that you use to connect to the device, and that can be easily decompiled, or you have a .NET executable. You can run PEID against that to identify that that's a .NET executable, reverse it, and get it right down into source. Or you may even have C or C++ where you have to take it down to assembly, which is a little bit more difficult. So here's an example I have. This is a wireless AP. This is from Zipiter's website. These guys were tapping into this using the HRES, and this is a really cool board for doing this work. And I was a Bus Pirate fan for a while until the last presentation I gave, and my Bus Pirate was epically failing me. And so now I don't leave. And Daryl giggles. So I now do not leave home without my HRES. I have two of them. I have one on my workbench and one on my bag at all times. I have my HRES right here because I never leave home without it. So it's really cool, and you can see what they've done here is they've tapped into I think this is a UART interface on this device, and they're using this to get their connection directly into the wireless device. So at that point, it's almost like a telnet connection. You're just pointing at the HRES, and then you'll get the shell or the prompt on this. It could be some weird management style interface all the way up to an embedded Unix command prompt. Yes, sir. Yes. Or USB serial. And OS X and Linux natively support these devices. So once you plug it in, you can just go in and look in your devices directory, and you'll see it sitting there. So, and then you can just set your XCOM or whatever you're using as your connection of choice into the device. You can just use that. So exploitation, this is physical exploitation, memory exploitation, all of those types of attacks. Management interface. This is we're going to go after the box, try to get shell, bypass firewall restrictions or data diode restrictions. We could even use creative methods like social engineering if we had to demonstrate insider threat on the box. But this is the all-encompassing, let's get some shells. And then the example I put up here, this is the Terminator framework. I use this for testing meters, wireless meters that go on the side of your house, the power meter. This is like the Metasploit framework for testing meters. So there's a management cable that clips on the front of the meter, and you can just hook this right up into your laptop and start hitting exploits into the meter to try to get data or try to compromise the box. I think this is a really cool framework. This is getting a lot of support online, kind of like Metasploit. And so it's in my toolkit for testing some of the ICS SCADA stuff, and I'm seeing a lot more tools being built out there for doing this type of work. And it's supports or implements the C1218, C1219 protocols for connecting to the optical interface on the meters. So pretty cool stuff. Pretty cool. So post-exploitation. So during this process, this is where we're going to map the risk to the target assets, right? And I say that because, so we've got our shell on the box, then we have to prove what the risk is to the site. A lot of times when I've given reports, you'll have people say, yeah, so what? Right? But if we can show, yeah, we got shell, we compromised your network, and then we gained access to this database where you store all this confidential data. It could be credit card data, it could be healthcare data, and we are able to exfiltrate that through this interface. Well, then you will get attention by doing something like that. So that's some of the things we're going to do in post-exploitation phase. We're going to do privilege escalation if we have to, and maintain persistence on the device. And one thing I put in here, so a lot of times we don't test this as pen testers, right? And I think we need to start doing more destructive testing, especially on these embedded devices. We tend to steer away from denial of service or anything that could destroy the device, but we need to start really testing the resilience of these types of embedded systems within these infrastructures. We want to make sure that if somebody's banging on this thing, it's not going to just fall down with this slight shove. So we need to push. That's why I'm saying 2 devices. Let's push to get that hard test on the device to make sure it's going to stand up when it needs to. And then finally, writing our report. our executive report and then the technical report. The executives don't want to see 25 pages of shell code. And I've seen pen testers write a executive summary with page after page after page of data dump and debugging. I'm like, why are you including this in this executive report? They don't care. Make sure that you separate those, right? The executives just want to see, hey, I got these guys and they're testing and this is the value to the organization. They're helping reduce my risk. If you have to give a proof of concept report to a vendor with shell code and all of that, give them everything, but keep it out of the executive report. So real quick, let's talk about building our lab and how we can do this at home. So I've talked to you about the process. I've talked to you about some of the things we need to be doing, but as researchers, as people who now we want to learn how to do this more, how do I do this on the cheap? And so some of the things I've been doing is going to the thrift store and finding old modems, Linksys routers, you name it, for like $1 and buying them and bringing them home and throw them on my workbench and then break them, pull them apart. If you let the smoke out, no one cares because it was $1. If you care about $1, well, it depends. If it's vinyl, I care about it. If it's a piece of crappy hardware that I can rip apart on my workbench, I don't care so much. And you can also get some cheap socks and shoes there if you are definitely down with the vintage clothing look. So, really cool way, an easy way to build a hardware versing system is on Raspberry Pi. And my buddy Steven did this, and I freaking love it. It's small. You can throw it into your bag. I mean, you can have a go bag with your kit inside of it. This thing interfaces with UART, I2C, and SPI. So that's a lot of the interfaces we see on these devices nowadays. You put your software right on the Raspberry Pi. So if you want to use Benwalk, your debugging tools, right on the Pi, and then you can just do all your work right from there. And it's very simple and easy to have that self-contained box and take it wherever you need to. And it's cheap. It's like 30-something bucks with the new Pis, and they have the onboard wireless. Yes, sir. Yeah, that was me. That's a cool device. We could talk more about that. What's that? No. So the Jtagulator is literally, it focuses on JTAG and determining JTAG pinout, if it can communicate with the JTAG interface. This is more of an all-around, hey, I need a platform to do reversing and I don't want to throw it on my laptop. I don't want to create a VM image. Maybe your company is not paying for this for you. You want to do it on the cheap. This is a cheap way to do it and throw it into a tool bag. So when you go down to Valley Thrift and you buy all of their DSL modems, you have your kit that you can take with you to Starbucks and look like a terrorizer. So tool time. So we're going to talk some more about the tools to do this stuff, and I'm trying to speed through this, guys. I'm not trying to delay, I promise you. So some of the things I like, a good soldering iron. Invest in a good soldering iron. Don't get the cheap, plug into the wall soldering iron. Spend some money. Something that has a digital dial that you can set the temperature on. You will thank yourself for doing it. I used to have the cheap one, and I don't know how many times I threw it across the room. I bought a decent one, and you can get them for about $60-$80, and they work great. Cheap multimeter, you can go to Radio Shack. Yes, sir.
How do you replace your tips when you do something special treatment? I usually have the cheap soldering irons, and I always have the short amount of time tips that just don't transfer the heat properly.
I'm actually, all I do is I tint my tip every time I use it. So I tint it, I clean it after it's tinned, and then I do my soldering when I'm done, and then I clean it again and retint it, and I have the same tip I've been using for 2 years, haven't had to replace it. So as long as you're tinning your tip each time, cleaning it on your sponge with water, you're good. That's been my secret of success. Couple multimeters in your kit. You can get a cheap $10, $15 multimeter at Hack Shack, and that's what I use, and it works great for me. Screwdriver set with the security bits. These are online. You want to get, depending on the embedded devices, they have the star bits or the little tiny bits, depending on what kind of stuff you're testing. If you're testing mobile, you're going to make sure to have all those bits available to you. Hot air gun or a hair dryer. If you have kids like I do, I have a daughter, I just steal her hair dryer when I need to take something apart that has the glue, and it works great, but you tend to upset her. So unless you want to get beat by your wife or your daughter, you may invest in your own hot air gun. Needle nose pliers, dental picks, and a decent supply of caffeine if you're like me and you like to have some coffee if you're working late at night. So some of the electronic tools, the Shicker and bus pirate, I've talked about that a little bit. JTagulator, the Soleil, which is a logic analyzer, so you can actually hook up to the bus and actually monitor what's moving across the bus. A Picoscope or DSO Nano 3, a couple of USB breakout boards, our Raspberry Pi to set our reversing system on, the Pomona 5250s. These are really cool. If you don't like to solder, you can go out and order a set of these. These are clamps that will allow you to clamp right onto the chip. And then you can just put the connectors right onto the Pomonas and then pull your flash image off, and then you can just take them right off the board and you're done. Right? This is the no solder solution for connecting to a chip, and they have different pins. They have 8, 16, 32, but the price goes up a little bit as you get the bigger ones, but they have a nice box that you can put them in, and they're really cool. Right? And then if you want to get into SDR, there's the Hack RF, the Blade RF, or the RTL SDR. And then software tools, IDA Pro, of course. I like Immunity over Ollie just because Immunity, I can use Mona, especially if I'm writing SEH or ROP type exploits. Mona is the shit. Pardon my language. Hex dump or obj dump, definitely for sure if you want to get down and actually look at something in a hex editor. Minicom, Radar 2, Flash ROM, GNU Radio, and then Killer B if you're looking at Zigbee. So we started looking at this and putting together a hardware kit, and so our small hardware kit's about $200, right? Raspberry Pi 3, Shikra, Pomona 5250 set, a small screwdriver set, a multimeter. You're in the game at $200 if you're doing this work. A larger kit, this is where we're saying, hey, you got a laptop and we're pulling it out of the used bin at work. But we've thrown the Soleil in here. That's the logic analyzer, okay? The Soleil is a lifesaver. If you get a logic analyzer, you're going to be able to do a lot more work. You're going to be able to see what's moving around that bus a lot easier. We're looking at about $465 to do this work. That's still fairly cheap, right? So let's talk about the demo real quick. I'll walk through this real fast, and then we'll do some Q&A. So I took a Siemens Speedstream 4100 DSL modem, and we walked through the whole pre-engagement process on this. So this was the board. We had identified 7 different areas of interest on the board. There was possible UART on the board at 1 here, possible JTAG interface at 2, the CPU, of course, is sitting right here, our flash memory at 4, this is possibly the RAM chip, SOIC flash module was here, and then an Ethernet interface. So when we do something like this, this is the type of stuff we can put in our report, right? We can just have our callouts, put this image right in our report. This is some of the information gathering that we're doing initially within the assessment. So some of the things we noticed right off the bat, that there were 2 ground pins on the back of the board, the square pins, those are generally grounds. So we can call those out as well, but nothing else really on the back of the board. So we did some Googling, started finding that there were different things on this board online, that there were some communication, how to set up the box pretty much online. There was some firmware update information online, and then there was a firmware image that we could actually pull down and reverse. So we went further and we validated that there was 64 megs of SD-RAM on the board, that we had a DC-DC converter on the board, which then validated the SOIC chip that we thought we had. The MIPS processor, we found the fact sheet online on this. This is all through Googling, right? And so we hooked up the JTagulator to the box, and the 14 pins really, it was kind of a miss. It was a buster, right? Which JTAG is kind of hit or miss. And we did test the UART connection right here with a multimeter, and was able to determine that we had a UART connection on the board, right? Testing the pin out. So some other stuff we found out online, DSL reports, and this is all just light Googling, right? So more research, understanding how this box is being set up. People were doing some, hey, home user, I want to be able to modify this box to do whatever, right? So there was a lot of data online supporting this. So multimeter. So as we're going through and doing the information gathering, we were able to determine the pin out and the ground and the power by setting the multimeter. And you can, I can't remember what they actually call this. It's the, I can see the actual, the meter setting on the board. But what you can do is you can set it so that if you put the red pin, or the ground pin of the multimeter on ground on the board and then touch each pin, if you get a tone, that's telling you that you have ground connectivity from the ground connection all the way back to the pin. That's generally your ground pin on the UART connection. So that's how you can enumerate ground on the UART pins. And then to determine which one of the pins is power, you can actually connect the multimeter to the pins and turn it on and watch the meter. And if it goes up to about 3.3 volts, that's generally your power pin. Now, if you see big fluctuations, that's your data pin. That means data is moving across that pin. And that's a good way of kind of determining what pins do what on the connection. Right? So here we have a USB breakout board connected to the UART interface, and that's, we used Bus Pirate, we used the USB breakout board to get our shell. And so once we got the UART port connected, we actually see here, we were able to run commands on the box. It was a limited interface, but we were still able to get command execution on the box. And get some information about the box, understanding exactly what version of firmware was running on the box, what the configuration, I don't know if you guys can see this or not. This is the config part number here. So we were able to actually get some information off the box. And so more interesting UART tidbits, we can actually see which ports are running. Yes, sir. This is Dev TTY USB 1. So some more stuff we got from UART. Without even running a port scan on this thing, we could actually see which services are running on the board as it boots. So you have FTP, Telnet, HTTP. We have 2 SNMP ports running there. I'm sorry, SNMP 161, and then we have a mail server at port 25. And then DNS also listing there as well. So interesting information about which services are running on the board. Do you have another question, sir? Yep. PPTP on 1723. So again, we ran the JTagulator on this, and it was Buster. We didn't really get anything on it. And you can see that here, I think, hopefully, that we weren't able really to get the pin out of the JTag. So then we hooked the logic analyzer up and booted the box and was able to actually see some interesting tidbits of data running through the logic analyzer. This is the Soleil management interface. So as you hook up to the device and actually boot, you can actually see data moving across the board. You can actually capture that like a sniffer and then do offline analysis of that data. So it's kind of cool. And if it's passing management keys across the bus, you can actually capture those. So then we ran binwalk on the image, and was, again, binwalk is hit or miss, right? You may have to actually you're going to probably have to work binwalk a little bit to get it to work on some of the firmware images out there. Sometimes you get lucky and it will extract automatically the first time, and other times you may have to be reading and trying to figure out some weird error and configuration change you have to make. But that's part of what being a hacker is, right? Yeah. All right. So some of the other things we did on the box, we ran Nmap on the box just to make sure that those ports were good. And what we did get back was FTP, Telnet, and HTTP. Those were the things running by default. So the documentation says that the Telnet username and password on the device should be admin, but that didn't work through the UART interface. And so we tried a lot of different things. But unfortunately, we could not get connectivity using that default account. So we tested the Telnet access on the box and got this weird sandbox menu with no ability to gain full shell access on the box. So, but it did give some cool remote functionality features for us, right? We were able to do some things on the box. Every time, though, we tried to use the web interface, it was Buster. We didn't get anything there. So we ran SMP walk against the box, and again, we were able to pull some more interesting information off the box. And you see this process, right? This is the same process we'd be doing through a pen test. Analyzing the ports and the services running, pulling data back from those ports and services and seeing what that data is giving us. And again, here we ran an S&P walk against the box, got some more information about the build, some more information about the device. And so as we sit down, we started threat modeling. We're like, all right, so we got 4 attack vectors. We got local physical access through the UART and the JTAG or flash extraction. We have network and local access through the Ethernet and the DSL interface. And then we had remote connectivity through a DSL interface, right? So our threat model, that's kind of what we're looking at, the 3 attack vectors. We didn't have a DSL. I didn't have a DSL line in my home, so I wasn't going to be able to go after DSL. So I was looking at either Ethernet or physical local access in my threat model. And for this one, it was mostly threat. The threat was going to be local. What could we do with physical access in the box? And so when I put this into a carver, and this is basically how I put my carver together, the UART and the Ethernet were popping up as the highest threats for me, right, based on my risk scoring calculation. And so I could take this threat model and throw it right into my report to say this is why I justified my work in those areas. So as I started going through the vulnerability analysis phase, we noticed that there was an update menu on the web interface that was unauthenticated. So we could actually modify the firmware on the box with no password needed. So that was kind of cool, right? So once we got the firmware extracted, we could actually patch the firmware, upload it to the box. And if it was a Linux shell underneath, we could just create like a kernel module, put netcat on the box, and create our own listener. And that would be pretty much it. But with UART, I'm sorry?
The firmware updater didn't have a hash check.
It did not. It did not. So we had this weird X shell on the modem, and we were trying to break out of it. And with the telnet connection, we were stuck at the login prompt, but we had no username or password for it. And so we used UART and created a user account with root privileges on the box, right through the UART interface. And so that command right there, the config, upro1, user, username Tim, password blank, and then the per is permissions. So that's a hex code, and we're setting permissions of all. Give me all permissions. FFFFFFF. And then once I did that, not only was I able to tell into the box, I got FTP access as well, as full control through both of those. And so logging into the FTP service, we could then download things like the x.config, x.def, the x.image, and the xboot.image files from the box directly. So then post-exploitation, once we get into the box, we now have a decent shell on the box, right? I can tell in directly. I've got this cool X shell. And we can start running config files, configuration commands on the box. I can see IP information. I can see routing tables. But it wasn't a full-blown Linux shell. Okay. It was still limited. But this account allowed us to maintain persistence because the account was created under the hood. And so it did not show up under the web interface of accounts on the box. It was a hidden account within the operating system. So the persistence was there. We didn't have to worry about bypassing AV. We're on the box. We're going to be there as long as we wanted to. And so then finally, as I wrap all this up, so we go through all this, we hack the box, and we start writing the findings. So I had 5 findings here, right? I had a physical access finding. The UART provides elevated shell on the device to allow me to do things. I classed that as a high just because you needed to have access to the box. I had elevated telnet shell after physical exploit. I tagged that as a critical. Elevated FTP access after physical access, or physical exploitation. I also tagged that as a critical. Web management interface allows for unauthorized firmware updates. I tagged that as a crit. And then finally, remote discovery via web management interface. So the web management interface had an actual unique banner name. And so we tagged that as a medium because we could find these things plugged into the internet. And so through that process, I was able to take this modem that I bought at the thrift store, walk through the HRES process from beginning to end, and actually map out the vulnerabilities for this box, right? And so closing thoughts. So where do we go from here? We agree the risks on embedded devices are increasing. We need to be doing work in this area. Security teams should be testing this stuff to identify vulnerabilities before we deploy these into our infrastructure. And what we're proposing, Stephen and myself, is the HRES standard to help define how we do this work. A repeatable process that has defined results so that we can take that to management to say, here's what we found and here's how we need to mitigate these risks. And currently the website hopefully is going to be online in about a week. We actually have the domain and I'm building it. The mind map is done and we're working on the technical guides as we speak. HREtaxstandard.com is going to be the website. And we're also looking at possibly setting up wikis and putting in LinkedIn groups so we can all start working together on this. So thank you for your time. I'm going to open up to Q&A. I know I was kind of blazing through some of those quick, but I was trying to be sensitive to time. Do we have questions?
Yeah, so I'm seeing more and more on embedded devices that the kernel at least has the ability to lock down UART, SPI, and anything else that isn't needed. A lot of times it'll be left on for development purposes, but then once the final product is shipped out, it's all turned off in the OS. And JTAG is always there, but that can be a real pain in the ass sometimes.
Yep.
So it's learning, like, in that situation, what would you actually do to try and get into the machine? Just going to the web interface, or just having to accept the smaller surface area?
I have not seen a lot of devices where the UART, the I2C, the SPI interfaces are disabled. I don't know if anybody else that's playing with hardware is seeing that, but a lot of times when I'm connecting into these pins, those ports are hot. And that's a problem. And I'm sure that ability is built into the kernel, and that's on these boards, but a lot of times these are not being disabled when they're going out in the field. Now, your question is, if that's disabled, and is there something else we can do on the box? And it just depends on the device you're testing. Sometimes I see a USB interface on the front of the box. It's unprotected, right? And so you can plug in a USB key on the front of this and it'll boot. And maybe the management process is it looks for firmware updates right there, and you can push new firmware with physical access. Well, if you have the firmware and I can mod it to disable those bits, then I can just push a new firmware update and then connect into UART, right? It all depends on the box. So I would say that's case-by-case basis. But the web interface, I've seen a lot of guys, Daryl does it all the time. He'll go right after that web interface and do command execution or something like that in there and get shells or create accounts or do whatever. SQL injection, I mean, there's a lot of different vulnerabilities we have to look at. If there's a database in this thing, I mean, that could be a potential as well. So things to think about. It all depends on what's on the box. Everything's going to be different. Yes, sir. Daryl?
Yeah, just a quick note on that. Yeah. Some of the devices that I'm seeing are smaller footprint devices, even though CPUs would be UART, and they all have a plus that's configurable. I've seen some of the smaller footprint devices may not have that functionality enabled within the code. And I'm seeing it in those. I'm not even seeing a full settings for the other stuff. I'm seeing, I'm looking at small footprint stuff. I'm actually seeing serial wire. For that type of stuff, which is even more more simple and less complex in those cases. And it really comes down to what the device does. Like when he's doing the bigger devices like that, I have yet to pop one of those open when a UART is not enabled on some of the bigger devices.
Yeah, we're really dealing with performance issues here, right? So we're looking at, so a lot of times we're telling our vendors, hey, we want to see encrypted communication channels from these devices back to a management plane, right? Well, the problem is that as soon as you throw crypto in the device, the performance goes in the tank, right? Because it has to manage that whole encryption and sending the data over encrypted channel process, and now all of a sudden you see the performance drop because it's spending so much time sending that encrypted traffic. And so now you're looking at it going, okay, security, performance. And now the business is going to look at it and be like, yeah, there's no way. So we're absolutely not seeing any of this stuff turn on these devices, and I think you're not going to see it for a long time to come. Yes, sir. That was off my MacBook. That was the shell from my MacBook I plugged in and then just went into the TTY USB interface there. Sometimes, yes, sir. On that board, I'm trying to think of it was a weird version of Linux. It was like an embedded version of Linux. I can't remember if it might have been BusyBox, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I believe that one's ARM on that box, on the DSL modem. Other questions?
So, with a lot of devices, it's becoming more popular for people to put their own open source firmware on them, especially OpenWRT, WRT, very popular and gaining popularity nowadays. Attempts to actually do security audits on these, and also those, how they run does depend on the device fit as well.
So the question is looking and doing an audit on like OpenWRT, some of the open source firmwares that people are putting on the routers that are out there today. And I know that there are people out there reversing it and looking at it. I know that there are people exploiting it, especially in some of these devices that are, researchers are building and putting battery packs on to take out to do like Wi-Fi testing and stuff like that. They're being targeted. So the question is, yes, people are looking at that. People are tinkering with it. I've been tinkering with OpenWRT and extracting it, looking at it a little bit more. Your second part of your question was, how is it running on the box? Or can you repeat the second part of the question for me, sir?
Learning what people are doing as far as looking at different versions of it, and because there's a lot of different versions of it out there now, and a lot of manufacturers are shipping out with some version of WRT by default, even if it's usually some hacked up.
Right. So I think there's a huge wiki and support group out there for that specific firmware, and it's got a lot of support. And I think you're seeing a lot of people out there playing with that firmware, making their own mods for it and pushing it online. So there's a group of people that support those firmwares and write it. I would direct you to that wiki and say they're probably extracting that firmware and playing with it on their own. And if not, maybe you go out there and volunteer your time. That's a good way to kind of get some experience in extracting firmware.
Yeah, played around with it a little bit, and a lot of fun things to do with OpenWRT.
Yeah.
I kind of see why it's gaining in popularity for embedded devices.
Slick. Anything else? Yes, sir. Embedded, you talking embedded Windows? Yep. Nope, I've not seen that. I've seen embedded Windows, like embedded XP. I see a lot. And that's really kind of fun to play with, because now all of your standard XP type attack vectors exist. You may have to play with the exploit a little bit and customize the shellcode depending on return addresses and whatnot to get code execution on some of these vulnerabilities. But the beautiful thing on embedded XP is that it does not have AV. So we don't have to worry about any type of our AV bypass. Things like Veil and stuff, we don't have to worry about that. We can just go right at the box. And now we're seeing embedded Windows, embedded 7 and Windows 10. If those devices, and I don't know, but if they have things like PowerShell, then Empire comes into play for us, right? So we can start doing direct memory exploitation using things like our Empire framework. And again, AV is not an issue because we're right into memory. So I'm seeing a lot more of Windows embedded out there than the Linux stuff, and it seems like it's a lot easier. So I don't know where I'm at on my time, but if I have any more questions, you guys can ping me offline. Thank you so much, Ohio InfoSec. Happy anniversary to you guys, and thanks for your time.